Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to be talking about database triggers. We've alluded to this in previous videos, and the main reason that we need to do this is related to our list types, our satellite types. If we're going to have this type of data structure for high performance in Bubble, then we need to have our list types, our satellite types, as we've been through in previous videos, and therefore we need to get data from what I call our container types, which actually stores the physical data, into the types that we're going to use to display lists, so that the list data can get displayed very quickly. But obviously this data here that's duplicated has to be in sync with the actual container data types. And so the way that we do that is using DB triggers, database triggers. Some people call them backend triggers. And the way that backend triggers work is very similar to how normal workflows work. They still work on the same paradigm, which is when an event happens, then do something. The difference with database triggers is that the event that triggers the do is events in the database. So in other words, when a new type of record is added, that's the event. When a field on a data type is changed, that's the event. When a record on a data type is deleted, that's the event. And so that's essentially how it's going to work. So in the previous video, which was a kind of an intro to workflows, we had this form, and then we had the name, the address, and the contact's first name and last name. And as we went through, this went into the one data type, this went into another data type, and this went into another data type, okay? And so what we did was we created the business entity that would store the name, and then we stored the address that then was linked to the business entity, and then the contact, which again was linked to the business entity. And as our final step, we then put the primary address and the primary contact for the business entity back onto the business entity record that we created, okay? And there were sort of 4 steps, and then we added a 5th step where we actually added that record to the satellite type. Now I'm going to go through a couple of cases why that's not a great idea in this particular instance, whereby you need to duplicate data. So as we looked at in the last video, you can obviously add your satellite types in a front-end workflow. In other words, your workflows that run on the front end. Okay, if that's what you want to do. There's a couple of reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. And the first one is to do with performance, or perceived performance by the user. Because if you got quite a complex workflow, and I know this is fairly simple, but you could easily get to the point where you're adding and updating, a dozen different tables in a workflow, and you're then in a situation whereby if everything's done at the front end, that's done in front of the user, okay, and they can't move on in their app while that's doing all of that stuff, if you like. Okay, I remember years ago I was working on a point of sale system, and we implemented it, and everything was being done on the front end in front of the user, and they were complaining that like they were putting a sale through and it was taking 30-40 seconds to actually create, because it was going off and firing off all these different, right into all these different tables and everything. And in the end what we had to do is just save the bare minimum and then move the rest of the processing to the back end. And in those days it was much more difficult to do. Bubble makes this really easy through database triggers to do. So in other words, keep the wait for the user at minimum, and DB triggers enable you to do that, to move the heavy lifting to the back end. Okay, now in this case, in this instance, this example we're going to go through here, it's fairly simple. All we're going to do is to take the data that the user has entered into a front end, save it to the main data types through a workflow on the page, and then make sure that a workflow gets triggered. But you're taking a step out of the user perceived performance, if you like. The second reason is, which is really key, is that this is fairly simple. You added a new customer, you've got all the details in there, that's absolutely fine. But what about editing the customer? Every time a customer is edited, we need to remember to update our satellite type, our list type, to make sure that that data is in sync. Okay, if we do it on the back end, we can kind of set it up, and as long as we know what we're doing and where the caveats and the limitations are, then we can set that up and forget it. Okay, whereas you can imagine on the front end, every time that a customer is getting updated, you're going to have to remember to duplicate that and what to duplicate. We set it up on the back end, and we do it once or with a couple of different triggers, and then we know exactly what it's doing. For example, the delete. I mean, if you delete a customer, you need to delete out the list type. If you update a field, an individual field on the customer, you've got to make sure that gets represented. So you've got to kind of have that in your mind when you're developing workflows on the front end. Whereas on the back end, you set it up on a trigger and it's done. You can forget it. You allow the back end to manage the integrity of your data in that regard. And the other thing is more secure. Anything that's done on the server is more secure. So if there is a situation whereby data has to be kept as private as possible, then that can certainly help as well. Now, there are a couple of downsides to using DB triggers. It does make your initial processing that little bit more complex because you've got to try and separate what's going on the client, what's going on the server. The other thing as well is that they're not subject to privacy rules at the back end. So if you're going to be doing additional searches within your triggers, you do have to make sure that you put your, for example, in our case, our SaaS account, our subscription and our company, we've got to add those as constraints into any searches that we do on the back end, because it's the one place where we can't rely on privacy rules. You've got to remember that your privacy rules are not in play at that stage, whereas the rest of the app, we kind of just, when all the privacy rules are in place, we can forget the fact that we're dealing with different subscriptions in a multi-tenant environment effectively. Okay, but with that said, let's move on and let's have a look at this. So I've changed this now to work as though we're going to work with database triggers, because in the previous one, we created the business entity, which is our main customer record, then we created an address, then we created our contact, and then we updated our business entity again, if you remember, with the primary address and primary contact from the previous steps, and then we created our satellite type, our list type. Now, if you imagine that what's going to happen here is that we only want that business entity list type, that pipe business entity type, to get created when our main business entity is created, okay? And that kind of has to be the last step. We have to have all of our information ready so that when the database is triggered based upon a new business entity record being created, that's when we're going to create our list type. So by the time we create this, all information has to be there and readily available. We can't put this at the beginning and then keep adding to it, because it could be too late by the time that's added. And remember, our pipe business entity, our list type, has got information like the contact first name, contact last name, the address. So if we had this to create a new business entity as step one, we wouldn't have the information by the time that the trigger gets picked up, because that's going to get picked up pretty much instantly, okay? So we have to create all of our subsidiary types first. Now, obviously at that point then, if that hasn't been created, we can't hook these back. Okay, but what we can do in step 3, we got our primary address and we got our primary contact. So we do know which is the correct information to use. So we know that we can rely on that. If we didn't have that information, then we'd have to look for a different strategy. But in this case, we don't. And let's make it as simple as possible as we go through this example. Okay, so we're going to create our address, our contact, then our business entity, and then we're going to leave it. Now, this is something that's important here, is you can get into a muddle where you're almost like in a spaghetti of database triggers firing off on all sorts of things. So what I would do, it's really important, this is on step 3, is just to make a note for yourself in the notes section to just say, this will trigger the creation of a list record for the pipe business entity type. Okay, just so that you know when you look at this that is what is getting triggered. You may also need maybe put a little bit on the title of the step so that you know. So maybe just put DBT so that you can look at that and you can see that you know that action is gonna trigger a database trigger on the back end, just for bolt and braces. So let's have a look then how we're going to actually create our database triggers. Like I say, you've got to be on a paid plan with Bubble for this to work, because you're using server resources and Bubble are going to charge you for server resources. So underneath our pages, underneath our reusables, where we don't have any at the minute, we then get backend workflows. Okay, and then what we can do is to click to add a new backend workflow, and under general we then get this one, new database trigger event. Okay, so I'd like to color these something different, usually red, so that it kind of gives me an instant indication. Maybe also create a new workflow folder for them as well, just to make sure that you can obviously put these into different folders as you get used to it, but at least it's something you can look at to identify it. Okay, so what's the event name? So we're going to say, let's say create business entity list type. Remember, we won't be able to call these explicitly, so it doesn't really matter what they're called. They're not subject to the usual naming conventions of API workflows. So the type is, and this is a type we're going to receive. What type do you want to be triggered upon? Okay, and in this case, it's going to be business entity, because when we create a business entity in our front end, that's when we want it to be triggered. Okay, so that's the type it's looking for. And the condition about when it's going to get triggered on is in the only when condition. So with database triggers, what you get is the option of before change and now. So in other words, you can check on the condition it was before you made the change and what it is now. Now, it's important to remember that when you're checking for something on a new record, that before change doesn't exist, okay, because it's a brand new record. So what we do then is we say only when business entity before change, and then we can say is empty. So that's what we use, the condition we use to trigger this event when a new business entity is created. So now we get to the point where we say click here to add an action. Now it's important to note how Bubble implements database triggers, and that is that any action step that you put now on this event will not trigger another database event, no matter what happens. And this is where I think this is one of the things that people trip up over, thinking that they're not reliable, they don't always trigger it, etc. Is that any action step that you put in here now is isolated. So in other words, if we update, let's say, an address type in our action steps, and that address type has got a database trigger, if we put the action step here, that address type trigger will not happen. You just won't get it triggered, which is great if you do want to isolate them, because sometimes you can get into the situation where this is triggering that, which is causing that to trigger, and then that's causing this, and then sometimes you can get into these horrible sort of loops that that don't really make sense and can cause you all sorts of bother when you're wondering what the hell is happening in your app. Okay, so by putting your action events in there, that can isolate that situation, but most of the time you don't want to do that. You do, if you've got a lot of triggers set up, you do want them triggering in order to make sure that the right data is getting updated at the right time. So when you do that, then you need to add the action steps into a different workflow. You can't add them in here. So just as a standard practice, okay, unless you know you want to isolate that trigger to just update what you want it to update and make sure it doesn't go off and do anything else, unless you specifically want to do that, then what you will do is you'll set up a new workflow. So in this case, it's going to be a new API workflow. Okay, and I'm just going to put that in, let's say, I don't know, let's say cyan, just so that I know it's a particular type. So this one is going to be called create BE list type. Let's just call it that for now. Expose as a public API. No, we don't want it to do that. Okay. So ignore privacy rules when running the workflow. Okay. Now that kind of contradicts what I said earlier. I'll qualify that in a second. Okay. So we can put this into a different. Let's create a different folder. And we will call this API. We'll just call it API, and we know that they're what they are. So what we do need to do is to add a parameter here, and I'm going to call this, I'll just put it in lowercase, business entity, not in lowercase, and let's just select business entity. And the reason being is that obviously because we're calling a different workflow, we need to pass in the one that's in the trigger into here. Okay, so let's do that now. So we created our workflow, so in our trigger we're then going to trigger that event or call that event. So then we're going to say schedule API workflow, and it's going to be this one. Okay, and the schedule date is going to be now, so we're just going to put current time. so it gets called straight away. And the business entity that we want is going to be business entity now. Okay, that's the record in the state that it's been saved in. So we can select that, and that's going to pass then that through into here. Okay, so just to reiterate, the reason that we're doing this is because in the action steps within the trigger itself, it's not subject to privacy rules first and foremost, and secondly, any other triggers that are relying on any other change that we make in that workflow do not get triggered. It is isolated. So therefore, by calling a different API workflow, we then have the option to make it subject to privacy rules. I said I'd qualify that. So what we can do is make sure that ignore privacy rules when running the workflow is not ticked. And also we can be assured then that any other change we make to any other data type in this workflow triggers correctly as you would expect. Okay. The only time not to do that is when you definitely want the trigger to be isolated and make sure nothing, and there are circumstances where that happens, when nothing else gets updated regardless of the data that you are working within the trigger itself. Okay, so we've got our new type, so then we need to add our actions in our workflow to complete this task. So if you can imagine, the first thing we've got to do is to grab the address record that we're going to need and the contact record that we're going to need, because we're going to need to grab that information out of those records to be able to put onto our list type. So one of the things to remember with Bubble's backend workflows is you don't have the luxury of the custom states. In other words, you can't store variables. There's a plugin that you can use that kind of half gives you some answers, but generally speaking, you can't just willy-nilly start, putting information into all sorts of different places and then pulling them in from everywhere. It just isn't going to give you that option. So nice little trick here, because what we do need to do is to get the primary address field out of the business entity so that we can then get that information out. So the trick we can use is to add a make changes to a thing action. Now we're not going to make changes to anything, we're going to kind of fool it. So what we can do, thing to change, is we're going to say the business entities, and then we're going to say the primary address, okay? And then we're not going to change any field in there. So further down the line then, if we want to add another action, let's say we want to create a thing, okay, then what we can do then is, let's say we want to, an address, have a look, then we then get the option for result of step 1. Okay, which means it's in memory and it's available to us. So it's kind of a way to store something in memory. So we can do the same thing with make changes to, okay, and we can then say business entities primary contact. Now if you want, obviously you can change these to make sure that you're not going to make changes to. So let's say you can just say get address record and get contact record, so it's not quite so confusing that you're thinking, well, what am I updating here? You're not updating anything, okay, just getting them. So then we got this information in there, we've got the business entity record as the parameter, so we've got everything that we need now to create our list type. So let's do that. Data things, create a new thing, and then we can just say pipe business entity, and then we can say, and it's important again that we do add our subscription and our org in there first, and we can simply grab those from the business entity because it will be exactly the same one, so we can rely upon that. And the same with the org, and we can say business entities org. Okay, then we need to attach it to the business entity record itself, its container type, so we've got a link in there. Okay, we can just assign that. Okay, and now we can assign the actual fields themselves. So the first one will be name, so we're going to need the business entity's name on that one, and then the type as well. And so what we can do, business entities type. Now it's important that the way we set this up is that that's an individual value and an option on an option set. This is a list of options from an option set, so we're just going to need select first item for now. Obviously we'll look at changing that in the future, but for now with our simple example that's what we'll do. And then we can pull the address, and we can pull that off result of step 1, which is our get address record, and we can just pull the address in from there. And then we can do the same thing with the contact information, in this case just the first and last name. So we can say result of step 2, get the contact record, and then we can say the first name, and then we can do exactly the same thing with the last name as well. Result of step 2, last name. There is something else that we do need to do, and this is where we do need to make changes here. So I just wanted to show you that, because that's a really useful tip to get records back into memory in a back-end workflow, because there are no ways to store it otherwise. But what we do need to do is to actually save the business entity back to these records, because if you remember in our front-end workflow when we created all of this, on our button save is that we created the address, we created the contact, then we created the business entity, which then triggers that off. So we didn't have the chance to write that business entity back to our contact, back to our address. So we're going to need to do that now. So back in our backend workflow, what we can do there is to say, yeah, we are going to make a change to this. We're going to change the business entity to be the business entity. Okay, and the same on the contact record. So we can say the business entity is the business entity. So we've done everything that we needed to do now on our back end. On the front end, it's much quicker, it's much faster, and also now wherever in our system we've got a workflow that creates a new business entity, we don't have to worry about this at all. We can just forget, we just can trust that the trigger is going to work. Now, like I say, I'm going to reiterate a couple of things here, is that because we've updated the contact record and we've updated an address record here with the business entity, that will end up triggering, if there was a trigger event set up on a contact record for the business entity to change, for example, then that will get triggered. Okay, if we wanted to isolate that, then we would put it directly into the trigger itself, and that won't trigger any other triggers, if you like. But remember, in the trigger itself, they're not subject to privacy rules. So if you're doing something where you need to go and search for some data, just bear in mind that you're going to have to put the subscription and the org as constraints, because they won't be subject to, remember, multi-tenant database and all of that type of thing. Okay, so we've gone quite long in this one. In the next one, I'm going to cover what happens when we change that information. You might be able to guess from what we've done what we need to do, but let's cover it so we've got all those bases covered. And with triggers, you can be quite strategic with this. There's some times where you can do it it's better to do it in a different way. Maybe the trigger's on a different data type, or whatever it is that you want to do. It all depends on your use case. I'm just giving you an example here, a simple example of how we would do it in our using the data schema that we've got. But listen, I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you've learned quite a bit from that. It's quite an advanced subject, database triggers. So just get your head around that. Take it easy, and I will see you in the next one.